This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective. So hello. We are here with Mariana Pinto Leitão Pereira, who's an archaeologist and who worked as a heritage professional at the Cultural Heritage Department of the Cultural Affairs Bureau in Macau, and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Heritage for Global Challenges Research Centre at the University of York. And we met last academic year, at the York Festival of Ideas, where you were leading a public, would you call it a workshop or an activity?
Yeah, a participatory mapping experience.
Yes, a mapping experience of a kind of effective geography of York.
No, absolutely. And then what it means, what York is for people, but also it's a part of a slightly bigger project that I'm doing on what it means to be familiar with the landscape and what it means to be local.
Yes, because your background is in between heritage, migration, diasporic.
Yes, and diasporas especially. And the heritage of diasporas, or let's say it, the legacies of movement.
Lovely. Because I've seen your bio, and you have a wonderful phrasing, which is your research looks at how migration shapes heritage, belonging, and the ways that we get to know the world.
Yes. So I've started being interested in migration quite late in my research. I did archaeology. I was interested in the past, in the distant past, so what some people call prehistory. And then I worked for the government, and maybe I should explain what this meant for me.
Yes.
So I'm Macanese.
Yeah.
I'm from the Portuguese descendant community of Macau. And if you want, I can introduce myself in our language.
Absolutely.
Vos bom nunca. Eu sou Mariana, eu sou maquista. Tem perto 3 anos. Eu tenho vivo na York. Eu estudo patrimônio de Macau com gente de Macau. So, I just said I'm Mariana, I'm Macanese, so we call ourselves maquista, or gente da terra, or filho da terra, so sons of the land, right? And then I said I've been living in York for the past 3 years, or almost 3 years, and I research heritage of Macau and the people of Macau. And basically, I was born before the handover of Macau to China. And so I was born in a Portuguese territory. And having witnessed the handover, many of our families weren't really sure what was going to happen. Yeah. It was an imagined future that we didn't know what would look like. And Portugal was offering schemes for government employees to settle in Portugal, and my parents took that. And so I arrived in an imagined Europe, right? The one that we would only see during our summer holidays, but we didn't know what it was about. And at the same time, we were Portuguese. Anyway, I arrive in Portugal, I do archaeology, and I forget about Macau. I never thought it would be different to be from Macau until I got the job in Macau, in the government. And that's when I realized, wait a minute, why do I identify myself as Portuguese? Am I even Portuguese? And that's when my relationship to my identity changed quite dramatically. And I started saying, no way, I am Macanese. And that means having part of a Portuguese identity, but also having all the Chinese and Asian experience and legacies. And so working in the government allowed me to reconnect to a heritage I had no idea of, because growing up, we went to Portuguese school. We learned what Portugal was teaching their students. Sure. We learned the rivers of Portugal, the train stations, which we don't have trains in Macau. We learned about the geography, what was, the crops, the different times of the year, which are very different in Macau, right? The seasons. But no one taught us about Macau.
Sure.
No one taught us about history, literature, the language, the food. We didn't know about that. We only knew about what was spoken at home. And so going back to Macau meant rediscovering all of that history that is not yet done. And so after the handover, we picked up from a couple of people who were bravely doing the history of Macau before the handover. But a lot was left unspoken and still is.
Sure.
And that's where I started rediscovering a little bit of who we are. What does it mean to be Portuguese and, in the sense, European, beyond the borders of what Europe sees itself as in the present?
Sure. And I love the idea of imagined Europe, to which we'll go back in a second. But it's interesting, the dynamic of you having to leave Macau to discover yourself or to understand yourself as Macanese after seeing yourself as Portuguese because of an imposed educational system. So I was wondering whether that came also from how people from Macau who moved to Portugal through these schemes of return to the motherland, fatherland, how were they perceived in Portugal? Were they seen as Portuguese? Were they seen as, were you seen as sons and daughters of Portugal, intended as a Portuguese protectorate colony?
Well, thank you for that question. It's quite a complex one to answer. Some of the answers I'm going to give you, I only found out because of my own research, my own PhD research,
Right.
And the research of others who looked at the Macanese communities outside of Macau. Some of these researchers looked at those who went to Portugal, considered to be the ancestral homelands, right? So what does it mean to return to a place that you are seen to belong to and are told you belong to, but actually you never really been there, you never lived there? And the experiences are very different. They're very varied. And I guess maybe this is where perhaps racism comes in. Not that people blatantly tell you anything, they don't. But the Macanese are mixed. And depending on whose families or which families you come from, you will look very different. So we have our friends who have ancestry from Malaysia, who have ancestry from Japan, who have ancestry from Goa. We all look very different. And so depending on what you look like, you're going to be received differently. But there was a big misconception about what it meant to come from the last Portuguese territory outside of Europe. Even today, people are like, oh yeah, Macau, where is that? After more than 450 years of Portuguese presence, we would have hoped that Portugal would remember, but no. People don't remember, people don't know. And so what type of relationships are we talking about? They're quite unequal, right? Those who are coming outside of Europe who see, especially during these imperial spaces, right, where we see the metropole as an imagined center. You don't need to go there for it to have an impact on who you are. But this center doesn't know who you are. And it doesn't matter what happens to you. And so going to Portugal was not easy, but of course I have an amazing group of friends who understood and who could see from my perspective. But that idea that Portugal had, that it was one single space, of course it wasn't. You could see the big differences between things. And I think this is where a little bit I would say it was precisely those differences that actually led to a lot of amazing writers to write about Macau because of how different it was.
Sure.
And so, yes, that experience of going to Portugal was strange. But, you know, when the handover happened, and this is something that I will never forget, it happened from the 19th of December, 1999 to the 20th of December. And on the 20th of December, me and my mom went out. We saw Chinese flags everywhere. It's normal, of course, for a country to celebrate the return of a territory.
Of course, because we were talking about the handover from Portuguese administration to Chinese administration, right?
Yes, and I can give a little bit of more detail about that. But I remember on the 20th, on me and my mom specifically walked around the city to see what it looked like. And that was a period of extreme uncertainty. We didn't know what China was going to do with our community. We're a minority. So, of course, the majority of the population in Macau is Chinese. Anyway, on that day, on the 20th, me and my mom were walking around in search of our Macau. Right? Could we still find it? And there were a lot of Chinese flags. A lot of Portuguese symbols were taken out of buildings or destroyed or covered. Wow. Some of them covered to be uncovered later, which is interesting, right? This idea of heritage and the use of the past for present-day purposes. So, I mean, a lot of things are still there now in Macau.
But they remain as ghosts.
They remain.
You can't see them, but they're there. No. They're covered, and then we uncover them.
And now they're completely uncovered.
And now
they're very visible. But at that time, they weren't. We didn't know. Yeah. And the only place where we saw a Portuguese flag was, of course, the consulate. And so when my mom arrives there, she says, look at that flag. That's your flag. So what does it mean to be Macanese? What does it mean to undergo a geopolitical transition where the territory where you are sitting moves away from you? This is a little bit what I was talking about in my thesis as like I don't know how to call it, the migration of a landscape.
Sure. Where
you see yourself as part of a landscape, but not of the present one. And so we were ghosts of the past. We just didn't know how to fit in the future. We do fit now. But that idea that my mom had, that flag was representing me, played a part in how I saw Portugal. But Macau has a quite turbulent history, but amidst the history of colonialism, let's look at the Portuguese Empire. I think Macau is perhaps one of the least violent spaces, one of the most accommodating spaces, and one of the most different spaces. So when the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century, and again, a lot of what I'm saying is not backed up by archaeological evidence. We still do not have this data. But the feeling that I have from reading the research, the quite very good research that has been done about this from historical sources, is that the Portuguese arrive and somehow they settle. China was dealing with a lot of sea pirates, and they were having some disputes with Japan especially, but they depended on several products that Japan was selling. And so somehow the Portuguese become the intermediaries. Of course, we're talking about an imperial space that is very different from what would happen later during the 18th and 19th century. So this is the beginning of an imperial period where Spain and Portugal, of course, are much more prominent.
Sure.
But it was mostly driven by commerce. And this idea of commerce means that it doesn't matter what you look like. I'll do business with you if you want to do business with me. And so there's this amazing description of the Portuguese by a researcher whose surname is Espanha. And he says that in the 16th century or even before, if you wore a hat in several parts in Asia, you were Portuguese. And so Macau sits at that stage where it is commerce that drives settlement. And then we have the arrival of the Dutch, the English, the French. And so the 17th century saw the decline of commerce in Macau.
Okay.
And then in the 18th century, actually 19th century, we have the Opium Wars. And so what happened with the Opium Wars is that everything changed. At the time, the Portuguese, who had been in Macau already since the 16th century, so we're talking about several hundred years already, where they already have a mixed community. And we arrive in the Opium Wars, and when the United Kingdom claims Hong Kong, Portugal takes advantage and claims Macau indefinitely. Although the Chinese version doesn't say that. Only the Portuguese one.
Yeah, because then there's because of the geographical position of Macau, you have this kind of double narrative.
It is a double narrative, and for a long time people have been calling it that, but I think it was a three-way narrative because the Macanese were in the midst of all of this. So who are the Macanese? Of course, like many other identities, this is extremely controversial. And because Macau is not a nation state, it's a city that sits within a larger nation state, China, but was before that part of Portugal. It never had the possibility of having its own identity fixed in a passport, for example. There's, of course, a passport of Macau nowadays, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you are seen as Macanese by the community. So this is where things become complicated. Identities outside nation states are quite fluid. Before the handover of Macau, there was a strong idea that the Macanese were only the Portuguese descendants. Those who would claim to be Portuguese, who would speak Portuguese, or who would speak a version of Portuguese, which in the 16th century was, you know, you arrive somewhere to do business with someone, you're not going to care if you say the verb, or you just want to buy something and they just wanted to sell. So a lot of Creoles, so-called Creoles, are born this way. And of course, the Maquista language, and I claim it as a language, was spoken and developed in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries because when the Portuguese arrive in the 16th century, there's no one there. That's why China allowed them to stay. There's the community on the boats, so the fishermen who lived alongside the coasts of Macau already existed, but on land, no. And so the Portuguese arrive, but they don't have a lot of people. So who do they bring? Especially, we're looking at the movement of a lot of women. So the sailors, the merchants arrive, mostly of them men, and they marry and bring women from other Portuguese colonies in Asia at the time, most of them from India and from Malacca.
Because Portugal also had some enclosures in India, one of them being Goa, which then will have a role in the 20th century with regard to also the kind of the presence of Portugal, both in India and in Macau.
No, huge role. And to be fair, the Portuguese arrived in a lot of places in Asia. They just didn't have a lot of people to sustain their presence there.
Sure.
And so, of course, Malacca, which was then taken from the Portuguese by the Dutch. Of course, it's also a very complex history in Malaysia. But a lot of women were brought from Malacca and they were brought from India. Why? Because they had already been converted to Catholicism. So religion is a huge part of this. These women would come to Macau, would bring their languages, their ways of cooking, their ways of dressing, and they would marry Portuguese. At that time, if you, like the situation of the hat, right? If you were seen to be Portuguese, you were Portuguese. And the Portuguese had been quite open since the 15th century to accommodating children who were born out of these weddings. They were seen as Portuguese.
Sure.
And so that identity was quite strong. And so what we have here is a group of people who are not from Macau, who are brought to Macau, and after several generations see themselves as, let's use the word, Macanese. Of course, because this was a Portuguese territory, all the Chinese community would see themselves as Chinese, right? So after the handover, 400 years later, everyone now calls themselves Macanese. At least that's the English word. In Cantonese, the distinction is there. In Cantonese, we would say O Mun-yen. That's people of Macau.
Okay.
That's different from Tosan Po Kwok Yen. Tosan means of the land. Po Kwok Yen means Portuguese. Portuguese of the land are what we would define as the Macanese. That's why when I introduced myself, I said I'm a Portuguese descendant of Macau.
Gotcha.
You know, that's the thing. What does it even mean to be Portuguese? Even in Portugal, what is that? But in Macau, the identity is very fluid, but at the same time, it's also very concrete. If you claim to have Portuguese ascendancy and you act on it, you're interested in the things that connect Macau to a Portuguese identity, but also that means you connect to the Chinese things that are part of your identity.
Sure.
And that can be visible in celebrations, in the food, in the way you do certain things. Nowadays, being Macanese becomes more complicated because since this is not a Portuguese territory anymore, it's a Chinese territory, you have to be very clear which Macanese you are. And in Chinese, that distinction is there. It is not there in English, and it is not there in Portuguese.
Okay.
But that's why we use the word maquista to specifically say, well, I am Macanese, born or descendant of those who were born in Macau, and I claim a Portuguese ascendancy. So it gets a bit complex.
Sure. But it does speak for the role of heritage in identity construction, having a strong sense of what the past was and where you come from in terms of generations back plays a massive, massive role by the sound of it.
And we have to see that at the time. So after 1974, with the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which was preceded by several years of colonial war or independence wars in Africa, which was very violent, very complicated. With the revolution, suddenly all territories that were Portuguese got their independence, leaving them in quite a chaotic state, except for Macau. And Portugal tried to, sadly, let's use the word, get rid of Macau already in the 1960s. But with the Cultural Revolution, China wasn't ready to get the territory back. It had bigger concerns. The Macanese never forgot that Portugal wanted to just give us away like that. That is something I think it's still spoken about.
Mm-hmm. Did the Macanese people at the time have any way to get a word in any of this?
Well, we have to see that the Macanese have been very skillful for the past almost 500 years of being a part of it. Many of them were interpreters. Of course, the Portuguese arrive and all the different governors who were sent by Portugal, they had no idea what Macau was. Everything needed an interpretation. So the Macanese are very skillful at saying what needed to be said in certain contexts. Yeah. And of course, many Macanese were a part of the handover negotiations. That doesn't mean that they could define everything. So Macau, of course, was in the 17th and 18th century, like I said, at the epicenter of commerce. When in the 19th century, China lost the Opium Wars, a lot of cities had to be opened, the so-called treaty ports. They had to open to foreign commerce.
Sure.
Those cities had a lot of jobs. Macau didn't have jobs. And so all the Macanese who were very skillful at commerce, at translation work, at business, they all moved to these treaty ports. So there's a lot of Portuguese descendants who had ancestry in Macau, who then moved to Shanghai, moved to other cities in China. They were there for 1-2 generations. And then with the Japanese invasion and the Second World War, they all come back to Macau as refugees.
Yeah.
Because that was the only Portuguese territory they knew. But they didn't speak Portuguese anymore because English was the language of commerce. So after the Second World War, these Portuguese descendant refugees from Shanghai who had lost all their documents because of the situation of Shanghai fled. They went to Macau. Macau had no jobs, so things didn't change. So they all migrated. Where are they? This is, of course, the Macanese diaspora. They are all in English-speaking countries. So the US, England, of course, here, Australia, Canada. They can't prove they have Portuguese ascendancy except for their name because their passport, their documents, their registrations got burned in the Portuguese consulate of Shanghai. So they can't prove that they're Portuguese. So we have that situation. On the other hand, in this process of negotiating who could claim citizenship of Macau, it was decided that you can only be a citizen of Macau, which is fair, if you are born there. You can't transmit that. What it's not transparent, and then you only become aware of this when you start researching, is that actually, if you are born in Macau and you're Chinese, it appears that you can pass down your citizenship of Macau to your children, but not if you have a Portuguese passport.
Gotcha.
So I cannot pass down my identity if I have children to them. I can pass down the Portuguese passport, but I have to tell them the story of who we are. And that is something very powerful that has been happening in the diasporas. That's the story they still tell, and they tell it with quite a lot of pride. And these stories are very powerful. You might not get recognition from Europe that you were a part of its imperial history, but people remember, and people still say it.
It is a unique history as well of identity building, because what you're saying is that there's whole communities who are relying on storytelling, on narrative, to build up who they are in lack of official documentation, of external recognition. So it's almost a grassroots paradigm for identity. It's difficult to call it reclaiming of an identity. It's really is recreating it. And so with the idea of storytelling, narratives, orality, what's the role of language then? Where's the Macanese language coming through in all of this?
Oh, that's such a central question too, because let's start with a small example to try and understand how to unpack this, right?
Sure.
Every 3 years, the Macanese diaspora does something called Encontro. It's the homecoming event. Everyone goes back to Macau.
From all over the place.
From all over the place. And China is very gratefully supporting all of this.
And sorry, because I remember that you explained to me there was a Chinese project of protection of heritage of Macau. So is that part of that? Was it from the early 2000s to the 2020s kind of thing that the Chinese government invested, I guess, in protecting Macau heritage?
Yes. So we have to look at this, and with some admiration, to be fair, we have to look at this because China has, and it's just ended, and it now is another one, had a 30-year plan for Macau that started after the handover. And one of the first things they did, so in 2005, they grabbed the historic center of Macau, they pushed it forward, meaning when you want to register something as a World Heritage Site, so this is what happened, the Historic Center of Macau became a World Heritage Site, you have to go through a list that's called a tentative list. So you hint to other countries that you have a list of things that you are going to tentatively try to make World Heritage. It has to be accepted by a lot of countries, so there's a complicated process. Macau wasn't on the top of the list. China put it in the top of the list. What does it mean? What was the narrative of this nomination? The encounter between the East and the West. Macau materializes the encounter between the East and the West. This is in 2005. And I think this is quite impressive. This is an example of how a post-colonial space can take the narrative of its colonizer, or of this colonial era, let's call it, and do something with it. Of course, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's an opportunity that many of other countries don't have. And so in this context, a lot of the expressions that are seen to be Macanese, Portuguese, are supported. And including in this is the return of the Portuguese descendants of Macau. Of course, these homecoming gatherings, and we have to say that, they were started by Portugal in 1993. That was the first one. A very rushed last-minute attempt of Portugal to have some memory of its presence in Macau. It worked.
Does this include both Macanese of Portuguese descent and also Macanese of Chinese descent?
The majority of people who come are of Portuguese descent.
Okay.
There's only one association, it's in Canada, that fosters the connection with the Chinese descendants of Macau. But this big event is mostly targeting the Portuguese descendants.
Gotcha.
Right? And so They go back to Macau. And in the midst of these conversations of asking who you are, who your family is, of not having to explain what a Macanese is, there's something really interesting that happens, which is a lot of people say the 1 or 2 or 3 words they know in Maquista. For them, that means, look, I'm Macanese.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if I don't speak it fluently. There are very, very few speakers or fluent speakers. And of course, here we go back at trying to understand what does it mean to be fluent in a language, and how do you measure this in oral languages, which is what Maquista is. It's an oral language. Just the theater group in Macau that is trying to sustain the language has over 50 people who have been a part of it and are learning the language. It's the only way you can learn the language, is one of the only ways. But there are many more speakers in the diaspora. And so I found it amazing that coming to this event where you want to show that you have a connection to Macau, you speak the language, even if you don't speak it in any other period of your year or of the 3 years that you're abroad. And so language continues to play a huge part. Of course, it is also during these homecoming events that you see the different stances that are taken towards language, and how Portugal still has a little bit of an idea of what Macanese should be, of who the Macanese should be, because you hear from the Portuguese speakers, especially those who are in Portugal, those who got jobs in Macau but are not Macanese. So the Portuguese who were part of governing the city, who worked in multiple positions, who were there for several years and then came back to Portugal, many of them will say, no, who the Macanese should speak Portuguese. Being asked why you don't speak Portuguese becomes quite a complex thing, right? We have to understand that, of course, when I identify Maquista as a language, it's a bit of a rebellion. Right? A lot of languages that are perceived to be Creoles are perceived as such because in comparison to the mother tongue of the metropole, they couldn't be as important. And they are seen as a mixture. Of course, all languages are mixtures of different languages. But I think because within the colonial space and the imperial space, you can't have a language that is as important as the one from the metropole, all these languages, and I mean, we're talking about Maquista that was spoken fluently until 1960, when Portugal thought, wait a minute, this is not Portuguese, you can't speak it. And they stopped people from speaking it. And in 3 generations, we almost lost it.
Yeah.
Right?
Because, of course, the status of Macau, the management of Macau on the side of Portugal was also kind of aligned with the political status of Portugal itself. So when Estado Novo was the thing up until late 1960s, I guess there was an insistence on let's reinforce this idea of Portuguese belonging and Portuguese greatness and Portuguese identity. So anything that goes out of that, it's a danger in itself. It's the colonial state crumbling.
Absolutely. And I think things become so interesting when you look at, okay, how is it that some people who come, from Canada, who actually had been there for several generations, right, come and say a couple of words of Maquista. It means the colonial machine didn't have the power to actually do what it wanted, even though it tried.
Yeah.
Right. And nowadays we fortunately are having Maquista books for the first time, several of them directed at children, which is really nice, but not only in Maquista, in Portuguese and in Chinese. We're really going for the 3 languages, of course. But you can see that there is a hierarchy in languages, and it's very complicated to sustain a language that is not seen to have an utilitarian use, which is very sad because, on the other hand, you can see in these gatherings, in these homecoming gatherings, language's identity. It doesn't matter if I say it correctly. It doesn't matter if I don't use it anywhere else. The fact that I'm using it means it is important for me, and I will sustain it because it shows who I am to those who recognize it. Yeah. And that is a feeling that is very hard to get from anything else.
Sure. But the idea of a theatre that carries on a language and has taken on itself to not reinvent it, but reinvigorating it, maybe, bringing it back to the public attention. There's also that respect of the orality of the language, which is central to Macanese.
Well, we have to see this with a bit of history, of course, because, well, first of all, the theater group, and it's led by Miguel Sena Fernandes and by several Macanese, and they're opening it up to children, and it's been amazing. Of course, Miguel Sena Fernandes is the son of Henrique Sena Fernandes, one of the biggest writers of Macau, Macanese writers. And he's very good. He's the one that writes all the scripts. But this goes back also to a history of comedy, of orality, of shows and performances that were put up by the Macanese as forms of entertainment. And the Macanese here plays a role because it's a language that you can use it very well for comedy and for intervention theater, let's call it that. It's what the group is called Doce Papiação de Macau, so sweet language of Macau. And basically it is a comedy, let's call it like that, of social intervention. It's where you put out for all the people what the hell is going on in Macau at the moment. And they do it through laughter. They do it by making fun of it in the Maquista language. So I would say that this is an amazing way to, I don't know if the word repurpose, right? I don't know what word should be used, but to sustain a part of our identity that we didn't really know what future would have. And like we say in Maquista, con chiste, like it has fun, it has a joke in it. The Maquista is perfect for this because it's loud, it has a lot of very funny words, and it's very good to say things that can be interpreted in different ways. So you can be sneaky about it. I think it was an amazing idea. And I'm very happy that they did it.
Yeah. And I've seen that in English, there's a translation of Miguel de Sena Fernandes of Enrique's poem that is available to read. And there's this sense, which is also in the name of the theatre company, of the sweet language. And so with this conversation and the previous that we had, I'm starting to see some themes. There's the idea of the sweet language, and at the same time, there's quite a strong attachment to the land. At the beginning, you said about the Macanese people being sons of the land. And at the same time, there's quite a strong sense of physical geography and physical presence of the Macanese. I think I'm more asking about your own emotional response to these ideas, whether you see a different relationship to land, to the soil, or to the water landscapes.
I think that's that is a very deep question, and I cannot. It's very difficult to describe the feeling of home that I get when I arrive in Macau. But this land, of course, like you've said, yes, it's there, but it's not there at the same time. A lot of Macanese actually arrive in Macau after having been away for a long time and being part of the diaspora and all of that. They don't recognize Macau. Macau has more than tripled in size in the last 25 years because after the handover, gambling became, so it was liberalized. And before that, of course, gambling was part of the city, but it wasn't the main driver or one of the biggest drivers. And I think we had 3 casinos before the handover, and now we have over 44. That land didn't exist. That's all reclaimed land to the delta. And that's something that I find incredible, is that we hold the memories of commerce and of a very close relationship to water and to a delta that is no longer there. It has changed. It has shifted. Now there's land. I know there's many streets that I go to that I'm like, I remember the water being here. And then the next year, I remember the water being there. Water is moving all the time, but here it's being displaced. The water is being displaced. by the casino. So this attachment to land, to water, right, is moving, it's movable. And so what are we attaching ourselves to? And I think it's very hard to say. There are many Macanese who are not going back to Macau because they don't see it as their home. So I would think that, of course, this idea of sons of the land, filho da terra, is very much ingrained in the physicality of Macau. But the sense of being part of the land is still very strong. So what are we attaching ourselves to? Is it just an imaginary? It's not just an imaginary. There's something else going on here. And I wonder, the feeling I have is when I meet other Macanese, there's something very powerful being created as a community. So it's not an individual necessarily, but as a community. And that goes across the diaspora. And the connection to this imagined, real, movable land is as strong as the physicality of it. And it creates strong emotions, so strong that for some people, they can't go back because this other Macau that exists for them has gained more relevance, and it's sustaining their identity perhaps a bit more than the physical space. But I wonder if we should be thinking of other ways of creating belonging and locality that go beyond the physicality of land. Maybe landscapes that can include, that have to include, that need to include the waterscapes, of course, the deltascape, right? And I think that's what we are. We are a delta community. And deltas are very interesting because they bring land from other places onto another body of water. They carry land. They grow, they shrink, they have to, or else that won't be a delta. And so I wonder if we can be deltas, if we bring our land, sometimes more, sometimes less, into another land. And I think what happens nowadays is the experiences we are having outside of Macau, we bring it to Macau. That Macau becomes a different Macau. Then we go back to where we're living and we bring back that Macau, and then we keep going back and forth. And that is creating a different space. That is creating a different landscape, a different geography. And I don't know how identity relates to these movable spaces, in the sense that I don't see identity as fixed and I don't see landscape as fixed. So there is no way of existing besides movable landscapes and movable geographies and movable identities. And so for me, it makes complete sense that we call ourselves sons of the land, and that land is always changing, whether it brings negative or positive connotations or feelings. It's still our land, and we will be connected to it, and we will stand by it through its transformation. I think it's that emotional connection that is, the affect of the landscape.
Absolutely, because I was going to say, well, it feels like it's a different paradigm of belonging, of identity, and of emotional attachment. We feel that often these things depend on our senses, on our lived experiences, and how much these can be reflected in what we're living at the moment. We go back to a place consciously or unconsciously looking for something that made that place relevant in the past. Whereas what you're presenting here is the total opposite. This is a people who has been used to change, perpetual change, transition periods. So you lose the geographies of your childhood, but still within the context of a diaspora, which in itself is an expansion of belonging and of community, there is a convergence point that doesn't reflect any of anyone's memories. So let's not forget that we met last year at the Festival of Ideas, and these all happened because of one word in Macanese language that you candidly shared with me. And so I was going to ask you, what two words do you think we need in these times And I hope that this word that I'm thinking about is one of them.
Well, of course, in that workshop when we met, lingunyonya was the word that I shared with you, and I think it encompasses so much of what it means to be Macanese and somehow a part of Europe, or a part of a Europe's vision that might not necessarily be current, but it is a Europe's vision, which is a Europe that's beyond the borders of Europe. And lingunyonya is a beautiful expression because it means the language of mothers, or the language of women, right? Precisely to say that our language, the Maquista, was particularly or especially formed because women were coming from these different communities to live in Macau with their Portuguese husbands. They didn't master Portuguese very well. And so this is the language that comes up. It's a language of an attempt to be a part of something, an attempt to communicate, but it was also a language transmitted by mothers, right? And I'm very proud to say that Maquista is a lingunyonya. It's a language of women, precisely because you would learn it from your mother, and that means they wanted to share it with you. They wanted you to know what it meant to be a part of this history of movement that is so unique and peculiar and is very little known.
So it's not just a mother tongue, it's a women's tongue.
It is a women's tongue. And I think I'll go back a little bit to writing. Mm-hmm. And some of the most important Macanese writers, of course, were men. It's part of it. But there were a couple of women. And these women talk about precisely this. What it means to be Macanese, first as part of the Portuguese Empire, and now as part of China. And perhaps I'll bring up two cases just to explore a little bit this lingunyonya, this language that gives power to women, a language of women. So the first author that I really like and I really admire, Macanese, Diolinda de Conceição. She was born in 1913. Her father was Portuguese. Her mother was Macanese. She spoke about language, and she says, in Portuguese, she wrote in Portuguese, that it is rare for Macanese to speak only one language. The majority of them will speak several, especially Cantonese, English, some of them French. So multilingualism has always been a part of the community, and you get frowned upon if you just speak one language. It is not possible. You can't just speak one language. So that doesn't even exist. The question is, which languages do you speak? And of course, before the handover, you had to speak Portuguese. After the handover, the question became, well, you don't speak Chinese. How come you don't speak Chinese? So language plays a huge part, of course, in placing you and in placement. And so Diolinda was saying, of course, the Macanese have always been multilingual. But for her, this multilingualism reflects, going back to this idea of the encounter, it reflects Macau and the Macanese as this space where, and let's use these very big words, the Orient met the Occident. Like we say it in Portuguese, o Ocidente, o Oriente, o Oriente, o Ocidente. But Diolinda de Conceição was very good at showcasing how complex identity can be and how that identity can be translated into multiple languages that you speak. And another author that I really like is Cecília Jorge. So she's also Macanese. And she wrote a book of poems. Poemas para Macau, poems for Macau. And she writes very deeply about the condition of the Macanese and how, and their evanescence, right? It's like you almost can't capture it. And she wrote something that I think it's very important to understand in these communities that had their origins in an imperial space and did not necessarily continue to have an attachment to some of this imperial space.
Sure.
And Cecilia Jorge wrote very beautifully, and I'll read it in Portuguese. She wrote in Portuguese, again, which is something interesting. Miragem de olhos postos no Ocidente e coração suspenso. So it's like a mirage, right? With your eyes on the West and your heart is suspended. This goes back to this idea that we continue to look at Europe, but we are not really sure if Europe is looking at us. And this goes to the idea that Macau was a bit abandoned by Portugal, even though we have a language that grows from Portuguese and it's dearly loved. And it's not just her poetry. Many authors express this sense of this love towards a Portuguese-speaking space that is rooted in, it's a love that's, what we get in return is indifference and the unknown. Not being known, I think, is even worse. People not acknowledging that something happened.
You're not foreseen. Mm-hmm.
And so for me, Lingunyonya is all of that. It's a story of people who are speaking, and in that speaking, transmitting a very complex history of belonging to a space that doesn't even see them anymore, has forgotten about them.
Sure.
But is also a space where people come together because of that history, and they come together quite strongly.
Yeah, it's fascinating for me to see the parallels with some of the views that Afro-Italian writers share exactly about looking at Italy and their mothers and grandmothers who lived through the Italian colonial rule, looking at Italy and then having to confront Italy's amnesia of these colonies when they would get to Italy and they would feel like they weren't foreseen. A black body was not foreseen as part of the national body. A Muslim body is not foreseen as part of the national body. But we're talking about people who, just as you were saying in Macau as well, who were born and grew up in Somalia, where education was in Italian. And so they were fluent in Italian. And that was their language. And perhaps Somali wasn't even a written alphabet at the time. So if you had to write in Italian. But then as you go to this center that has expanded, you become an intruder, a marginal thing, almost upsetting the national body that you thought you were part of. And it does speak for like how colonial violence has similar dynamics all over the world, and how languages in that sphere play this difficult role of being liberating in many ways, of, you know, the reclaiming and things, but also very contentious because they are the language of the colonizer at the same time. And is fascinating also the gendering, the
Lingunyonya. I think there's an interesting context to explain here when we talk about speakers of Maquista, which is, we know that several segments of the community had to disperse to English-speaking countries. And for them, connecting as an English speaker, connecting to the history of Macau means you learn Portuguese because you're connecting to Macau. And so this layering of identity and language speaking is complex.
Sure. So there's a kind of gate through Portuguese, through Portugal. I see. I do have a fundamental question, because it's such a complicatedly fascinating history, because going back to the historical side, there's the transition period and then the change of administration have been saying change of administration, administrative government, but all of that was also happening after the 1970s when, as you said, Angola, Mozambique got independence from Portugal. But would you say we're talking about the independence of Macau from Portuguese rule? Because we've talked about it as colonial presence for over 450 years. But then we have been saying transition period and administrative change. We've never said independence of Macau.
I think it's very important to go back to your point on land, because this question is directly related to how do you see the land of Macau. Macau was a Portuguese colony, but for a very specific period. So from the middle of the 19th century, and I would say until 1960, 1970, even though Portugal did not return, let's call it like that, the territory to China, the fact that Portugal wanted to just abandon the Macanese, I think in our minds that meant okay. But also there's something else going on there, which is the Chinese version of the treaty in the 19th century never said that Macau was Portuguese.
I see.
And then after the Carnation Revolution, Portugal itself changed the status of Macau to be a territory administered by Portugal for political reasons. So these are definitions imposed from above. Mm-hmm. So Portugal and China are deciding. We talk about the handover because it was indeed a very powerful moment that marked, that shaped our sense of belonging. But I don't think many of us felt a diminishing of our sense of identity or connection to Macau. I would not see it as a question of being independent. I would see it as we are still there.
Sure.
So I think for the eyes of the Macanese, despite the rupture created by the handover, we continue to be there. And that sense of continuity is more important. The fact that we can still speak Maquista, and I can still speak Portuguese, and I can still go to church, and I can still eat Portuguese and Macanese food, and I can still see the buildings that were a part of our history. I think that's much more important. And I guess the question, of course, here is, what is independence?
Sure.
But no one ever spoke about independence, because I think in our minds we always knew that that was not necessarily our land, even though we are of the land.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that this idea that it is not our land, but we are of it, creates a space where you are open for change, perhaps more than if you would claim the land. Knowing that our ancestors, of course, arrived in Macau, and I mean, several of us have Chinese ancestry as well, we are open to see it change. But we will continue to be of the land.
Sure. Because if you don't have ownership of the land, you're not...
Yeah, we're not going to lose it.
Yeah. You accept the change that is implicit in the relationship between you and the land.
I guess for me, the most important is we stood by the land.
Yeah.
Even though, like I said, I see the handover of Macau as Portugal giving us to someone else, but I'm not abandoning Macau.
No.
I'm going with it, with all its complexities and difficulties and challenges. And so every day, knowing that you don't fit is also one of the reasons why the homecoming event is so good, because you suddenly don't have to explain all of this anymore. But we do, and I will always explain it.
That is wonderful. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. I was so looking forward to having a podcast on language and such complex entanglements that it gets caught in. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Mariana.
Oh, thank you so much. And I guess I will say my last Macanese words.
Yes.
Obrigado tudo, gente. So thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you. This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.